Hello.
Hello, Bob.
Hello, James. How are you?
Doing well. Got a closing schedule for tomorrow on my own.
All right. Yes. Good job.
Hope it goes well.
Yes, for sure. Absolutely. How are you doing, Julia? One of the things I'm still getting used to with Zoom is taking the time to pause between comments or questions so people can unmute themselves and come up with a question or whatever. It's so different than in a live class where you're actually seeing people and you can get their attention and work through the process. So I'm still adjusting to that. But it's a lot of pluses in this technology and gives us a lot of versatility that I think will cause us to continue to do this even in the future when we don't have to. We'll just find it to be a very convenient way to pull in a lot of people. Hi, Julie Gate.
Hi.
Where are your coworkers?
In the living room,
Ah, well, good.
hopefully with minimal interruptions.
Well, you never know. So do we think everybody has received and has the 1 to 4 family contract, which is what we're going to use to go through the class and deal with the selected paragraphs that we're going to talk about, much like the last 101, where we went through about 7 or 8 specific paragraphs rather than just split the thing up into thirds. And the thing that really works well in a Zoom is we've got a lot of opportunity for questions and conversations and be able to to go back and forth and deal with it. So does everybody have the material? If anybody didn't receive them, got to figure out a different way to work through letting Julie and Julia get that information to you. If you don't have it, this would be a good time to let us know that you still need something.
Yeah, because I can always email it out if I need to, if you weren't able to access it the other way I sent it.
Okay. So without any other questions or whatever, I do want to go ahead and get started. And we've got the 1 to 4 family contract that we're going to talk about. And we all know this is the most common contract form, TREC contract form we use. What you may or may not be totally aware of, TREC has 6 contract forms. All 6 contract forms are based on the 1 to 4 family. So the other 5 dealing with the unapproved property contract, the 2 new home contract forms, the condominium resale and the farming and ranch all have the same 24 paragraphs and all have the same. So once you really become familiar with the concepts and what's in the 1 to 4 family, you really understand all the rest of them because they're all based on this same thing. So as we go through this, just like in a live class, really encourage you to ask questions, give comments, so we can all learn from each other as we go through the process. Okay. So is everybody good? Any questions or whatever before we move forward? Everybody good? So I see a bunch of names. I see some pictures. I see, unfortunately, I see Max. Hi, Max, waving at me. And Julia, how are you, Julia? And Julie. I see Michelle, we got there. We got names up there, and we got Edie. So hi, Edie, how are you doing? Okay, so we're going to start off with paragraph 2. If you don't have the information, this would be a great time to say to Julia, Julia, email it, send it to me, because I don't have anything. So as we move forward. Now, in this contract between 2 parties, it doesn't matter how many people there are or how many companies or corporations, there are only 2 parties. There's a seller and a buyer. And in this contract, they're making certain promises. sellers promising to sell something, buyers promising to buy something. And in paragraph 2, and this is something we'll discover in all the paragraphs, the heading of the paragraph says property. Everything in paragraph 2 talks about the property. In fact, what we'll discover is we start off at the very beginning of paragraph 2 with the actual definition of the property. So last time we talked about paragraph 1 and the parties, now all the variables there. Paragraph 1 makes a reference to, and they use the capitalized word property in paragraph 1, and we see in the very first sentence of paragraph 2 says the land improvements and accessories collectively referred to as the property, capitalized term. So we've just defined in this paragraph, we've just defined exactly, not kind of, not almost, not approximately, but exactly what the seller is selling to the buyer and what the buyer is buying from the seller. And we're having a legal description, improvements, accessories, and exclusions, all in paragraph 2. It's very important that the agents are very familiar with what happens in this in paragraph 2, because the buyer and seller, unfortunately, don't always read exactly what it says. And they're kind of trusting their agent to understand everything and to know what's going on. And so they don't really pay the degree of attention to it that they that they really should be. So it's important that we understand what it means. Right from the very beginning, when we see the paragraph 2A, where we talk about land. And what we have in 2A is what we generally refer to and is what the courts make use of as a legal description. And the courts require certain elements in a legal description. Now, there are really only 2 kinds of legal descriptions in Texas: lot, block, and subdivision and platted subdivision, and a meets and bounds description. There's one other government survey one in some kind of unusual situation, but for the most part, it's those 2. Now, because the vast majority of times, easily 95% of the time, a house or a property that you're using the 1 to 4 family residential contract is going to be in a platted subdivision. It doesn't mean you can't use this for a house on 10 acres out in the country. You can, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But the reality is, most of the time, you're going to have a platted subdivision within a municipality, within a city, or maybe within an extraterritorial jurisdiction of a city. And so you're going to have a lot, you're going to have a block, and you're going to have a subdivision. So you get this information. If you've got the buyer, the legal description should be in MLS, if your property is in MLS. Otherwise, you can go to the county jurisdiction and you can look up on the tax rolls and it'll have it. And so it is very important that you have that lot and you have that block. And the third item here, after block, you have a comma there and you've got a place for a blank, it goes to the next line, says addition. That's the actual name of the subdivision, the platted subdivision that this lot and block are located. It's really important that you're very specific on the subdivision, because you can have the exact same lot and block in different phases of a subdivision. Whiffletree, for example, has like 9 different phases. And you could have, the same lot and block in Whiffletree phase 3 and phase 4 and phase 9 and so forth. So you need to be very, very complete and very specific in the name of the addition and the name of it. So Whiffletree phase 9, for example, you really need to be very specific on that as you go through it. And then you have the city, and then you have the county, and then you need, because a number of years ago, the court said for every piece of real property, improved real property, we need a street address. And the street address includes, the number, the street, and the zip code. You don't repeat the city again because you have that in the previous line. You don't repeat the county. And it's in the pre-printed text, it says Texas. In fact, these contracts can only be used in Texas. So you don't have to put, 123 Main Street, Frisco, Texas, because you've already got that information. But that's going to be the legal description and the concept of the legal description. Courts say we want a description that is so specific that if we needed to locate the property to take some action, we could do so from that description. So it needs to be very clear and very specific. Now, if you've got a piece of property out in the country, house sitting on 10 acres outside of a city, you can still use this contract form. What you simply do is you put in here, you can still put, the county, you can still put, if you've got an address, but then you also put in here, see attached addendum, and what you'll have in the addendum is, a meets and bounds description, an abstract description. You'll reference that addendum in paragraph 22, where we list all the addenda for the property, for the contract. So, while 95% of the time it's going to be in a platted subdivision, nothing keeps us from using this contract form for a house sitting on 10 acres or 20 acres or 50 acres, out in the country somewhere. You can still do that if that's what's appropriate and that's what the parties want to do. Any questions right now so far on paragraph 2A before we get into the section of this paragraph that costs agents a lot of money? So do I see silences? Everybody says, yep, Bob, we understand it completely now. In fact, we could teach a class on this. That's how well we understand it. Okay, I'm glad. Now, the next paragraph, 2B, improvements. And you'll notice that land, improvements, accessories, all within that definition of property. Improvements are established here where it really tells you that's what we're talking about. We're talking about a house, because if you're into a contract and the only improvement on the entire property is a barn and it's not a resident, you wouldn't be using this contract form. You're using this contract form because there's a resident, there's a house that people live in. It's habitable. That's why you're using this contract form. So it's a house, it's a garage, all other fixtures. And there's a really important phrase when you look at all other fixtures, the above described real property, and then it goes through the process, including, and we talk about the permanent installed and built in, but you see in that third line down, fourth line down, the two words, if any, which means all these things we describe, if they're included in this property, if they're on this list, if in fact they do have wall-to-wall carpeting or mirrors, ceiling fans, things like that, then that's all part of the improvements. But they don't have to have it. You may have a house that has no ceiling fans. The buyer and seller are okay with that. That's what it is. And because of the words if any, the seller doesn't have to add them. Because if you didn't have the words if any, and you had a list there of all the improvements that were going to be sold and conveyed from the seller to the buyer, then the seller would have to make sure all that stuff on the list was there. But because we have the words if any, it doesn't have to be there. Does that make sense? Are we good? Now, here's our challenge with the list of improvements and, frankly, the list of accessories in 2C. Texas Realtors has a nice little three-step thing that really defines what a fixture is. And we have a phrase in here where it says permanently installed and built-in items. In the very last sentence, all of the property owned by seller and attached to above described real property. So when a court looks at whether or not something is included as a fixture or included with the property, they'll look at what the contract says. They'll look at what they figure, how something is attached or customized to a property, and they'll look at the intent of the parties to determine whether or not this is something that really is part of the property. Well, we have to understand, just as we have to understand the bold print of permanently installed and built-in items, we don't define any of this. We don't get to decide what goes or what doesn't go. We have to have a conversation with our client, buyer or seller, and make sure that what they think is going to happen is what the contract actually says. And if the buyer thinks they're going to get the refrigerator because they just moved in from Florida, and Florida refrigerators tend to go with houses, and they figure they're going to get that nice big side-by-side refrigerator, looks pretty built in, and they expect to get it, and you don't have the conversation with the buyer to make sure that the seller really intends to leave that, then as an agent, you're going to be buying a refrigerator. It's always cheaper to pay for a refrigerator than defend a lawsuit you may or may not win. And that's an absolute every time situation. So as you go through this, we need to make sure you have the conversation, with your seller. When you're taking a listing, one of the things you need to do and walk around with this contract when you do it, make sure your seller understands what he's committing to a buyer with. Walk through the property with your seller, every room, in the garage, everywhere, and say anything you're going to take with you, regardless of how silly it seems, anything you're going to take with you, let's talk about that right now. Best scenario is let's get it out of here before we put it on the market. So it's never a problem. But if it's a situation where, well, I'm not going to take all the blinds down while we're still living here, well, okay, I understand that. Then we need to understand if you're going to exclude something, then here's the process for excluding it. So you need to make sure that you do this. Now, you'll do this in 2 steps. One, you'll do this with your seller in the listing agreement. In paragraph 2 of the Texas Realtor listing agreement that we use, it mirrors the paragraph 2 in the contract. And you'll list all the exclusions, all the things that the seller won't take with him. You'll put it in the listing agreement. You may even mention something in MLS. Seller's going to exclude certain items. You may have it in graphics. You may have it in flyers. All that's good, but none of that counts unless it's in the contract itself. So those are all instructions from your seller. If the seller says, well, we want to exclude that custom chandelier in the dining room because that's beautiful and it's great. We're going to take it to our next property. Seller gets to make that decision. Seller has got to make sure it shows up in the contract. And when you get an offer and the offer does not have in paragraph 2D, that chandelier is an exclusion, you need to have that conversation with the seller. The seller may say, well, I excluded the listing. We've told them in MLS, we're going to take it. All that should mean that we get to take it. No, none of that means that. So you need to say to your seller, okay, you told us you wanted to take the chandelier with you. Do you still want to do that? Or is this such a great offer you're willing to give up the chandelier? Because the buyer in this offer didn't exclude the chandelier. And so you need to have that conversation with your seller client to help them understand this is what has to be done in order for them to be able to take that chandelier with them or the refrigerator or whatever it is they think they want to take with them. Does that make semi-reasonable sense so far? We good? Questions on that? I promise you, you've got to make sure you're comfortable with what's in 2B. And that may be comfort may be too strong a word, but you need to. And in relationship to that, you need to understand the last sentence in 2B, all of the properties owned by seller and attached to above described real property. A key phrase there is owned by seller. You may have a tenant in the property, and the tenant may have some things that look like they're going to go with the property, may have some things in there that a buyer expects to have because the seller didn't exclude it. Well, it's automatically excluded if the seller doesn't own it, because you can't sell something you don't own, although sometimes people try to do that. So the reality is you need to make sure if you've got a tenant in the property, we need to make sure if you've got the buyer, the things the buyer's are really interested in thinking they're going to get it, you need to have that conversation. Because if it's owned by the tenant, there needs to be something else worked out because tenant's not a party to the purchase contract between the buyer and the seller. Does that make reasonable sense? Now, paragraph C, accessories. None of the language in paragraph B, which talks about permanently installed and built in, none of that is in paragraph C. In paragraph 2C, you've got a list, and this is just a list of all the accessories, and anything on the list, whether it's attached, not attached, doesn't matter, stays unless it's excluded in 2D. And where we still find ourselves with problems, in spite of the fact that it's clearly stated there, we'll have sellers who'll take the curtains. They've got custom curtains in the master bedroom that go with all their other stuff in there, and they'll take I can't believe you thought we'd leave the drapes. This is family heirlooms. This goes with all of our other custom stuff. I can't believe you thought we'd leave it. Well, it's on the list. It's specifically on the list. So, drapes, things of that nature. And we still are having a little bit of a challenge in dealing with fireplace screens. fireplace screens that are just sitting there, not attached or anything. People say, well, that's just personal property. It's just sitting there. Well, but it's on the list and it's supposed to stay. And so you need to make sure the seller understands what's in that paragraph. And if he wants to take it with him, make sure he excludes it. Good. So any questions on that? Now, 2D. Seller makes a clear statement to the buyer. Here's something that I'm going to take with me. You don't get it. And this may show up. The seller may have already said something in MLS, and the buyer says, okay, I'm fine. I don't like that chandelier anyway. You get to take it. And so the buyer makes an offer with that item in there. And so the buyer may have been very cooperative from the very beginning. Or they may not have it in there, and then the seller's going to have to make sure if it's still important that they counter and they put that in there. Because 2D gives the right for the seller to take whatever that is. It does not convey, it's not part of the legal description of the property. It's not part of the definition of the property. And so it's very important for us to understand that. Now, having said that, in spite of the language of what it appears to say in 2D, there is no obligation of the seller to remove anything from the property. So the seller can literally leave everything in that property, be an old property, really cluttered, old refrigerator, washer and dryer don't work, all kinds of, old furniture. Seller says, I don't want to move that. We'll just let the buyer have it. Nothing in the contract makes the seller take that stuff unless the buyer and seller agree that the property will be vacant and maybe use the phrase broom clean, which we use in commercial. But yeah, you gotta do that. Otherwise, seller can leave everything. And because of that, if you have the buyer needs to understand that. Because when the buyer closes, gets keys and goes to their new house that you're gonna move into, they expect to see a clean, vacant property. Nothing in the contract requires the seller to clean it. Nothing in the contract requires the seller to remove all their junk and all their stuff. They can leave everything there. And that's why if you don't have that conversation with your buyer, they're going to expect you to take care of that. So you got to be able to work through that process. So we see what we're doing in 2D and what's important there. Any questions on that? Hearing nothing, I'm going to go to paragraph 3. Paragraph 3 on one level is an extraordinarily simple paragraph. Really, all that really counts in paragraph 3 is one part of that paragraph, and it's 3C. Seller needs to know how much are you paying me. Buyer needs to know how much I need to pay you. And that's really all it is. 3A and 3B, frankly, are just information. Buyer is saying to the seller, okay, I'll pay $200,000 for your property. I've got $40,000 cash I can put down. And if I can find somebody who'll loan me $160,000, I'll pay you $200,000. So the buyer would put 3A, $40,000, 3B, $160,000, 3C, $200,000. 3A and the 3B are just information. Unfortunately, sellers will look at how much the buyer is putting down, how much the buyer is borrowing, to look at different buyers in multiple offers to decide what the seller thinks is a better buyer or not. And it may be that in a particular transaction that might be a good criteria. It's not necessary that it's true in all cases. And your seller needs to understand the buyer can change the down payment, the buyer can change the loan amount. And as long as the seller doesn't incur any cost, buyer doesn't need the seller's permission to make that change. I mean, extreme example, buyer could be, buying the property, can put 20% down, borrow 80%, pay $200,000. And then the buyer decides later, you know what? I'm going to pay cash. I'll just pay cash. So the buyer decides he's going to come to the closing with $200,000 cash. Buyer doesn't have to change the contract form to do that, because the reality is it's all cash to the seller at closing anyway. So the buyer doesn't have to amend the contract. Buyer doesn't have to have the seller's permission to come to closing and pay cash. So 2A and 2B are just information. I thought we'd gone past this, but I just had a situation a couple of weeks ago where the lender had instructed the buyer to put information, financing information, to include fees they rolled in. Well, you're not supposed to do that. 2A plus 2B has to equal 2C. And in that example, because of having money that was put into the loan amount, 2A plus 2B no longer equal 2C. That's an absolute. It always has to be the case in the contract. Now, we don't care what the lender and the buyer do in their loan documents later. In fact, the promissory note that the buyer is going to sign off on often is a very different number than what you have in 3B of the contract. And that's okay. That doesn't really matter. So, you're okay with that. The key from your standpoint is everybody needs to be in, understanding that 3A plus 3B, that's just information from the buyer and the seller. It's not absolute and doesn't necessarily have to be how it closes. We good? Questions on that?
Hey, Bob, this is Brian DeLuca. Can you just review how that lender, what they had done so that A plus B did not equal C?
Yeah, what they had done is they had rolled in actually rehab fees in that situation that changed the loan amount different than the loan amount that was in the contract or should have been in the contract. And so the lender rolled in those, creating a different thing. And we understand the lender says, well, this is actually how much we're loaning the buyer. We're loaning this amount because that's including some additional fees. But the reality is that's not information that should go in the contract itself. That's dealt with in the financial documents. So it doesn't need to be there.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank you, Brian. Good question. Now, one of the paragraphs that I want us to talk about is paragraph 4, which is an extraordinarily simple and easy paragraph. Okay, so I see in a chat from Marcia, if buyer changes loan times such as conventional FHA, do we need to amend that? Good question, Marcia. The simple answer is no, but probably. Here's your challenge. It depends on what the lender is going to require. If you have an original conventional loan and you're going to shift to FHA, the lender will likely require additional documents for an FHA, such as that, mandatory document where everybody says, yeah, as far as we know, everything's good. And the lender will probably require that the final contract documents reflect the actual financing that the lender is going to use to close the deal. Now, typically, that happens at closing. And most of the time, the seller says, okay, that's fine. It's happening at closing. I'm getting the same amount of money. It didn't cost me anything. So I'm okay with that. But the seller doesn't have to agree to it. And if the seller doesn't agree to it, the buyer's lender may say, well, if we don't correct the contract documents, we're not going to close on the deal. In a case like that, the buyer's lender says, not going to approve the loan. And it's because of the type of financing, whatever. And then we've got a debate about whether that's really a buyer approval situation or a property approval situation. But what we do know is when the buyer starts off with a conventional loan and they shift to an FHA loan, they don't gain any of the protections of an FHA loan unless the buyer and seller agree to amend the contract. And seller's certainly not required to do that. We have it go in the other direction. We have an FHA go to a conventional. I just had this happen yesterday in one of our Rockwall transactions because of some FHA requirements. They had to go conventional with a different down payment. And everybody agreed to amend the contract, so they're going to be moved forward. But if they hadn't agreed to do that, then that contract would terminate. So while they can do that, it's going to come down to what the lender requires. If the lender requires the contract be changed in order to make the loan, both parties can do that, typically at closing. But we have to keep in mind, neither party can ever be required by anyone. Either party cannot be required by the other party or by a third party, such as the lender, to do anything they don't want to do. You can't make the seller, you can't make the buyer agree to amend the contract. They say, no, now the deal may fall apart, may go away, but you can't make them do it. So good question, Marcia. Does that semi-answer that? Kind of. You follow up on that? Yep, she says, yeah, okay. Now, the reason I want to talk about paragraph 4, TREC has, when they did this, and by the way, in the new contracts that were just sent forward to the TREC in their meeting this week on Monday, and TREC approved in the new contract forms and put them in the public registry for comments. Paragraph 4 is being moved to paragraph 8. So we'll have new information 4, but the concept is still the same. And TREC has this line of consanguinity, immediate family, that they say, if you've got that, you need to disclose it. Our policy, our brokerage policy, is if there's any relationship on any level at all, any level, then you have to disclose it. You don't have to be real detailed. All you can do is say, buyer's agent is related to buyer. Now, it may be by marriage, it may be, second cousin of the third wife or something. Doesn't matter. If there's any kind of relationship, it never creates a problem when you disclose it now up front. There's never a downside. You're not going to have, if a buyer makes an offer and says, buyer is related, and say, well, how are you related? Well, they're my second cousin. Oh, okay, fine. It will not ever kill the deal. However, if you don't disclose it and later problems begin to occur in the property, they'll use that against you. So our policy is to go beyond the immediate family. Doesn't have to be parents, siblings, children. It could be cousins. It could be by a marriage. It could be anything of that nature. If you've got any type of relationship, you need to have a statement in there, buyer's agent related buyer. And you need to be specific about, for example, if you've got a situation where you're going to disclose that seller is a licensed agent. Well, are both sellers, both husband and wife, both licensed? Or is it the husband or is it the wife? Whichever one is specifically licensed, you need to be specific about that. We don't just say seller is related, because seller means everybody in that first paragraph. So we need to make sure we do that. We good? So, and here's what we also want. Paragraph 4, if it does not apply to you, tell us that. Put an A there so that we know you've actually read this paragraph and you're good with it and everything is fine. Everybody good? Now, in paragraph 6, and we talked about some of paragraph 6 in the previous 101, specifically 6C and 6D, but I want us to talk about specifically 6A8. Now, paragraph 6A, which starts on the bottom of the first page and begins the list of 9 items. And these 9 items are very important for the buyer to understand what the title company is saying to the buyer with these 9 items. These are all standard exceptions. When you look at your title insurance policy, you will see under standard exceptions, you will see these 9 things listed, depending on how old your title insurance is. If it's really, really old, if you had it 20 years, then you probably don't see 8 and you may not see 9. But these were all standard exceptions. And what the title company is saying to the buyer, before closing, you need to check all these things out. You need to make sure this is all okay. Because if later you discover there's a problem, you don't get to file a claim with the title company. Because we've already told you these are standard exceptions. You have no coverage in your title insurance policy. Now, number 8, which is on the second page, 6A8. This relates to the survey. And it says in the survey, and it tells us in the survey that, this exception, this standard exception, it deals with discrepancies, conflicts, shortages in area, boundary lines, encroachments, protrusions, overlapping improvements. All of this relates to what's in the survey. Now, 6A8 has additional language with choice I and double I, where a buyer can make a choice and says, you know what? I want to amend this exception. I want to have the ability that if there's a mistake on the survey and there's a problem here with one of these areas or some of these areas or all of them, that I could file a claim with the title company. And the title company says, okay, we'll allow that. We'll allow you to amend, to change this standard exception relating to the survey, except one phrase will still have to remain. And that's shortages in area. And what shortages in area refers to the exact square footage of the land. So if you're buying a 1 acre lot, you're saying, that's what I want. I want an acre. I don't want a less than an acre. I want an acre. Always wanted a house on an acre. That's what I want. Well, if you find out later there was a mistake on the survey and you don't have an acre, you don't get to file a claim to the title company, because if you amend this coverage, what will now show up under your standard exceptions phraseology, when you look in your title insurance policy under standard exceptions, all those other things go away. Discrepancies, conflicts, boundary lines, encroachments, protrusions, overlap improvements, all those exceptions, standard exceptions, they go away. The only standard exception that is still in that specific area in your title insurance policy, shortages in area. If shortages in area is your problem, you don't get to file a claim. Title company says that's an exception that still remains. The rest of it, if there's a mistake in the survey, and the rest of it is a problem if you've got an encroachment with the next door neighbor and there's a mistake in the survey, something we didn't know about, then you can file a claim. Whether you win or not, it's a different conversation, but at least you could file the claim. And so you could get it under any of these others. Now, the buyer gets to choose whether he wants to do it or not. Seller doesn't care. It doesn't really matter for the seller. And buyer gets to make the choice, says, yeah, I want to amend or don't want to amend. And then we get to make a choice. If we're going to amend it, who's going to pay for it? It's a pretty minimal fee. It's 5% of the premium for the title policy. So if your title policy costs $2,000, it would cost you $100 to amend this exception. Shows up as a line item on the settlement statement. And so it's 5% for residential transaction. For commercial, it's 15%. So you want to make sure you understand that distinction. So if the buyer wants to amend, and the buyer can do this on existing surveys or new surveys, our advice to our buyers, they should do this. It's very minimal cost. If they're really, really worried about the cost, and if they've got a lot of good leverage in the negotiation, check the box and have the seller pay for it. But the buyer should do it. It's a good protection just in case there's a problem. The buyer should always do it on the existing survey, because in an existing survey, the only recourse, if there's a mistake on the survey, the buyer would have is to file a claim with the title company. They can't have no recourse against the surveyor because the surveyor didn't do the survey for this buyer. And so he has no recourse against that surveyor. So on an existing survey, very important that the buyer amend this coverage, amend the survey exception. Questions on that so far? See, I've got investor purchasing home is, okay, so Marcia, point here, an investor purchasing a home is considered commercial, and it depends what it says. If, for example, the investor is buying under an LLC, under some corporate entity, then Marcia's correct. It is a commercial, and the cost would be 15%, not 5%. If, however, the investor is buying it under their name, their individual name, not under a corporate, then it could still be considered residential. So it depends on what they're saying in paragraph 1 and how they're buying it. Most of the time, investors who do a lot of flipping and rehab and wholesale and things like that are using some kind of an entity, an LLC or something. And so when they do that, they need to know if they're going to do this amendment, it's going to be 15%. Now, you need to pay attention to that, because what will happen is sometimes title companies they push the wrong button and the wrong fee shows up. So if you've got the buyer and your buyer is going to be paying for this, you need to look at the settle statement and make sure it's got the right number in there. We've had cases where the buyer is residential. There's no investor corporate kind of thing, but for some reason the title company accidentally put 15% in there, and your buyer's really not paying attention, and they're saying, well, wait, what's that number? You need to know what that number is. You need to know why it should be 5% and not 15%, or when it can be 15%. And your investor, by the way, certainly needs to know if you're going to amend this, your cost is different. If you're buying it as an investor, if it's a commercial deal, it's different than if it's otherwise. So good question. They just need to be aware of that because it does make a difference. Good question. Anything else? We good so far?
Bob, I have a question for you before
Yes,
we
sir.
move off of this paragraph.
Yeah.
It's a little bit of a different thing. It has to do with a new build. The buyer clients, I have the buyer clients, they have signed the contract for a new build. There was a title company that was listed on that contract. In the contract, it states that the buyer will be paying for title and that they can choose any title company that they want. If an amendment is drawn up, does that need to be drawn up by the builder? Or is that something that the amendment from the 1 to 4 family residence
Okay. And an amendment to do what?
to change the title company from?
Okay. So if we have a contract and we're at the builder's title company and the buyer wants to use a different title company,
Yes,
which was not named in the original offer, but we're in a contract now.
correct.
If we're in an actually executed contract and we want to change the name of the title company in paragraph 5, that would be an amendment to the contract. You need to make sure you also address the earnest money. Because there's a contract that's already been executed, has such and such title company, has the earnest money already gone to them? Have they
Okay.
started any processing? Are there any fees involved? So forth. You make sure you look at all that.
Okay.
Okay, good question.
And real quickly, Bob, with an amendment, because it's a new build, does that new amendment need to be originated by the builder?
Doesn't matter. Yeah, it doesn't matter. Can't come from either direction. As long as both sides sign off on it. And I'd use the track amendment. All the builder may have an amendment that they want to use, and that's okay. But yeah, either side can initiate it, either side can start it. That part won't matter.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you. So everybody good with 6A8? Because now that I see who all is here, then the next time we address this in the class, I'll look to you to explain it. Because I always in a class get a lot of questions about this survey exception and how we amend it and why we should amend it and why we shouldn't amend it. So make sure everybody's really on top of that. Good? Now, paragraph 11. And as many of you have said in on my classes, we often just kind of have a short conversation about paragraph 11, and my phrase is generally, don't do anything at all. Leave it alone. Just keep moving. And in fact, I tend to refer to the fact that what you can and cannot do is actually addressed in the text in paragraph 11, where it tells you, insert only factual statements and business details applicable to the sale. As the track rules prohibit license holders from adding factual statements or business details for which a contract addendum, lease, or other form has been promulgated by TREC for mandatory use. So if your buyer says, well, I want to make sure the seller knows that I've got to sell this house over here before I can buy his house. So let's put that in paragraph 11. This whole contract is subject to me selling my house. Well, we have a TREC promulgated addendum for that. So TREC prohibits you, says you can't put it there. Now, what's also not said here, but what TREC has in their rules, that any factual statements, any business details, any changes in the contract that are done to comply with the intent of the parties, what we've got to have, if your buyer says, well, I want to do this or that or whatever, I want to put this business detail in here, You need something in writing, such as an email from your client instructing you, here's what you say. Here's how I want to do it. Even a business detail. Because if you put a business detail in here and it turns out that it's a little different than what the buyer thought they wanted to do, then it's going to come back on you. So you need that documentation from your client who says, well, here's what I want to have happen here. I want the seller to pay for a survey. He's so proud of this property, let him pay for it. Because in the pre-printed text in paragraph 12, the buyer's paying for the survey. And so, I mean, for the appraiser. And now the buyer says, I want the seller to pay. Well, that's a business detail. Your buyer could instruct you, let's insert in paragraph 11 that seller agrees the seller pay for, the appraisal that's ordered up by the buyer's lender, however you want to word that. So it's very important that you have instructions from your client for any business detail. Don't just have a phone call. Don't just, the buyer says, well, yeah, let's stick that in there. Well, need something in writing. We're getting where more and more and more we need the documentation. On a regular basis, I'm seeing a challenge where we're having a later dispute about something, and people seem to have a bad memory about what was agreed to before. And all of a sudden they say, well, no, that's not what we agreed to, or that's not what I told my agent, or that's, and if we don't have documentation, we're in a he said, she said situation, which is never good. Courts don't ever want to be in a he said, she said scenario. So you really want to avoid that if at all possible. So always the documentation. So in paragraph 11, the big challenge, what moves us from being able to put a factual statement or business detail in paragraph 11 and having to have an attorney prepare something that's going to go in paragraph 11 is if it affects the legal rights of the parties. So if you're going to do something that affects the legal rights of the parties, not just a business detail, but the legal rights of the parties, that needs to be prepared by the principals, by the parties to the contract, or by an attorney. And if it's the principal who does it, you have to give written notice to your client. I see what you put in paragraph 11. You're a principal, you're one of the parties, you get to do that. However, I'm advising you to seek legal counsel because I don't even know what you've done to the contract. I don't know the impact of this. I don't know how this affects the legal rights. And I have no idea that the seller understands what you're trying to do here affecting their legal rights. So you need to talk to an attorney. You need to seek legal counsel. Now, so if the principal puts something in there in their own language and they stick it in there, you've got to tell them seek legal advice. If they have an attorney who wants to put it in there, no problem. In fact, that'll be our preference. Anything that affects the legal rights of the parties. And sometimes we get some pretty creative stuff. Buyers say, well, I've got a house to sell on you. We understand how that works. We understand the addendum. But a seller says, well, I want this contract to be subject to me being able to get to a contract on another property I want before I have to sell this one before I close on this, because I don't want to be homeless. Well, that's affecting the legal rights of the parties. That gets complicated enough where the buyer and seller have to go through a process, and the seller says, okay, I need to have an attorney draw this up. And then when the attorney draws it up, puts it in here, affects the legal rights of the parties, we're going to say to our buyer, you need to have an attorney advise you on what this means. Because what it could mean, what it could do could be significant. And that's why we have the good attorneys who will take a look at it and go through that. So if you're going to have anything in paragraph 11 that affects the legal rights of the parties, then you need to make sure it's either done by the principals under advice of counsel or an attorney does it. Questions on that? Questions on paragraph 11? We're happiest when we see nothing in paragraph 11. Because paragraph 11 really creates some interesting challenges to work through it. And the big challenge is that if we don't have the good documentation and instructions, we get accused of practicing law. Not a good thing. Questions? Everybody good? Y'all are really doing really well. I mean, we're zipping through. We're making great time here. I noticed in the email and everything on this class 1:30 to 3. So we're doing well. We're making really good time. And I'm presuming it's because everybody is so familiar with this contract form and saying, Bob, that's a good reminder, but I pretty much understood all that anyway. So, but thank you very much. And that's kind of how we work. Is that what's happening? Is everybody is really on pretty good with this? That's when you say, yeah, Bob, we're good. Okay, paragraph 12. This is a very interesting paragraph. When the buyer and seller enter into a contract, we know that it's important for the buyer and the seller, one, to identify who they are. We've identified the property in paragraph 2. You know, the buyer said to the seller in paragraph 3, here's how much you're going to pay for it. And what goes in paragraph 12 is interesting, because if the buyer and seller were just sitting down at a table and creating your own contract form, they might think of some of the things in paragraph 12, but probably not all of them. But what paragraph 12 really does, it says, in this process of the seller selling and the buyer buying and getting a loan and having it appraised and getting surveys and all that kind of stuff, there are going to be some expenses. There are going to be certain costs. And we're going to identify those costs in paragraph 12, and we're going to identify who's going to pay for them. And so we start off in 12A that here are expenses that have to be paid, and when do they have to be paid? At or prior to closing. We're not addressing anything here that's going to be done after the fact. And we start off in 12A1 talking about expenses paid by seller. And you see normal expenses, you know, in 12A, 1A, where you talk about the liens, existing loans, things of that nature. But the paragraph that we tend to make use of and are more aware of is 12A1B. And that deals with seller contribution. You've got a blank there for seller contribution. This is negotiated between the buyer and the seller. And if the buyer has any kind of negotiating strength at all, and they want the seller to help them with their closing costs, this is where the buyer would do this. This is also often when the buyer and seller have negotiated repairs and they've negotiated money in lieu of repairs. Lenders don't like to see those kinds of references in the contract. What lenders are okay with, though, is seller contribution in 12A1B. As long as it doesn't exceed the cap for the amount of the down payment and the loan type, then the lender's going to approve it. So if the buyer and seller own a, $300,000 piece of property, if they've negotiated, $3,000 in lieu of repairs, and they put that in 12A1B, so that's $3,000 that buyer's going to get credit, seller's going to have a debit, it's going to happen at closing. That will fall within the range of the maximum contribution that a seller can give to a buyer, because it's going to be anywhere from 3% to 6%, some rare occasions 10%. It's going to be based on the type of financing and the amount of the down payment as to how much this can be. It's going to be based on a percentage of the sales price. It's really important to understand this is another example of how a non-party to the contract, i.e. the lender, has control over what happens here. Because the amount at the very end of this 12A1B, it says as allowed by lender. And while the lender is not a party to the contract, if this amount exceeds the maximum the lender will allow, all that has to happen, lender says, nope, you got a $300,000 house here, and buyer and seller are agreeing to $20,000 in lender seller contribution. Nope, too much, don't approve it. And the remedy is the buyer's lender simply says, not going to fund the loan. So unless the parties can come together and work out some number that the lender does approve, the deal is going to go away. And depending on what the determination is about why it went away, will determine whether or not the buyer is going to get their earnest money back or not. But it's very important to understand that this dollar amount is controlled by the lender. And so if you've got the buyer, if you anticipate any kind of a situation where you need to make use of this, you need to talk to your buyer's lender and say, okay, based on down payment, based on the loan type, everything we're doing here, what would be the maximum seller contribution that would be allowed in this transaction? So you need to know that. So if you try to negotiate anything, you're going to be doing good. You'll be able to not throw an amount in there that won't be approved. Question on that? Are we good? Okay. 12A2 and 12A1, we talked about seller's expenses. 12A2, much larger list, and these are buyer's expenses. The majority of these expenses in 12A2 are lender related. A cash transaction, I mean, and you know, when you do a cash transaction, the title company closer walks in with a little bitty file and you're in and out in a very short period of time. There's almost nothing there. But if there's financing, about 85% of those things on the list, 12A2, are lender related. And you should know, you need to be familiar. And so your buyer needs to understand, here are things that your lender is going to say, these things have to be paid. And for the most part, these are pretty understandable, pretty common things will go with it. And a good lender will have already explained to the buyer and have it in their estimates. But certainly will have it in their CD that goes to the title company before closing, saying, yeah, here are all the costs, here are all the things are in there. If there's anything in here that a buyer wants a seller to pay, then that's a paragraph 11 business detail situation. Where a buyer say, yeah, like the appraisal or anything else that the buyer says, yeah, I want the seller to pay for this, that, or whatever, then you're going to make that change in paragraph 11 of the contract. Now, in 12B, this is a paragraph that has changed a little bit over time. It's a little more perhaps detailed or a little bit clearer. And it does make some reference. It didn't used to, but now makes reference to essentially what are non-allowables fees that FHA won't allow the buyer to pay. But essentially, if there are fees that are agreed to in the contract or an addendum to the contract, and if those numbers change, any expense exceeds what was agreed to, and it gives remedies. So if it changes, if something changes here, then that party, the party who may have that expense more than what was agreed to, may terminate his contract. For example, if the buyer and seller agree in the mandatory HOA addendum to certain fees, and the seller is going to agree to pay certain fees, it turns out those fees are in excess of what was agreed to. If the seller is still required to pay those fees, it gives the seller a right to terminate the contract. So it gives him an interesting little right that he otherwise may not have had as you work through that. Question on paragraph 12. She says, it's a hard part for me, giving everybody time to unmute and say, what did he just say? Was he serious about that? Okay. Okay, paragraph 13. This is where we really rely on a good title company to make sure proration is done correctly at closing. And we're dealing with all the normal items we think about, taxes, for example. We talk about some items, insurance, so forth, some items that are paid in advance. For example, the seller may have already paid for the entire year's worth of HOA fees. And so there needs to be a proration where he gets credit for time of the year where he's paid for them. He's not going to own the property. And so we need to make sure the debit and the credit show up in the right place. We need to make sure that they're prorating the taxes on the correct thing, because if you have a seller who has certain exemptions, those exemptions may not go with the property to the buyer. And so that may change what the proration is done at closing. Make sure you work with your title company so you've got those good numbers so you can help your buyer or seller be prepared for what the proration costs are. There is a nice little fee or nice little statement towards the end of paragraph 13. One, it kind of relates to taxes, because the title company, in some cases, they don't have really good tax data. Like closing right now, they're operating off of last year's taxes because we don't really have everything now for the coming for 2020. And so they're making certain estimates based on it, based on previous. And if those things changes, the buyer and seller agree that they're going to cooperate and work through if they have to change that. And then if the taxes are not paid or prior to closing, buyer shall pay the tax to the current year. So we got some phrase there that require past closing, some cooperation. You should know there's at least one addendum, and it's the addendum that Russell Rhodes' team is using, dealing with their Zillow properties. There's a TNC addendum that goes with the contract. In the prorations paragraph and in the rollback taxes paragraph, it in both cases says the buyer will incur any cost. So you don't have the ability later after closing for the buyer and seller to work this out and seller to pay their fair share. It's totally going to be the buyer after closing. Seller's out of it totally. So you just need to be aware when you have that kind of an addendum or you have something in there that addresses that, it's going to might be done in a manner that's different than what the contract itself does. And you want to be careful not to give legal advice or even tax advice, but make sure your client's aware of, here's what the seller is saying to you about this item. Anything that happens after the fact. Rollback taxes deal with the property that they're going to change the use. There's an agricultural exemption and now it's not going to be in, so there may be rollback tax that lasts 3 to 5 years that you have to roll through. We address rollback taxes in 4 of the contract forms. We don't address it in the 1 to 4 family contract form from track. So prorations, you need to be comfortable. This really just requires you to have really good coordination with the title company to make sure that how it's prorated is what your client expects, buyer or seller, and it's done in a way that everybody is pretty good with it. Questions on proration?
Hey, Bob,
Yeah.
is it not true that if someone protests their taxes and there's going to be a refund, that is between the seller and the buyer to handle in the next year, but the title company steps out?
Yeah. They do need to work that out if they know what it is, or if they don't know what it is and whatever it is, they agree to whatever split or however they're going to do that. That if there's going to be some kind of refund. So you can have 2 situations, one where it can be more and the other where it can be a refund. And in both cases, they need to agree how they're going to do it. And the proration paragraph really tells them they're going to work that out later. Yeah, so it is true that they need to do that.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you. Now, paragraph 14, we're at that time of year where we're going to deal with this. We've got the thunderstorm. I think we've got one. They're talking about something tonight or tomorrow. We've got thunderstorms. We've got weather events. And a reasonable question that a buyer and seller would ask when they enter into a contract and something happens and that falls into the casualty loss after the effect of the contract. And that's what the very first sentence in paragraph 14 addresses. If something happens, the reasonable question, buyer says, okay, windstorm came through and the roof's gone. Buyer says, I kind of was buying a house with a roof. I expect to still get a house with a roof. Who's going to put a roof on? Seller said, well, not me. I'm not going to put a roof on. Buyer says, well, you have to. Seller said, well, where does it say I have to? Well, paragraph 14. Now, I'm glad we got Max in on the call. And Max, you confirm if this is true or just something I make up. Max actually had a transaction in which there was an event, and we asked the seller to take care of it. And the listing agent came back and said, no, seller didn't agree to paragraph 14.
That's a true story.
That's true. And so our question then becomes, are there any other paragraphs in the contract we should be aware of that the seller didn't like? Because it's kind of, you don't get to pick and choose which paragraphs you like or don't like. So it's important for everybody to understand, because there are no blanks or boxes or anything in paragraph 14, but it's a very important part and choice of what the parties agree to. And the seller has agreed in paragraph 14. If something happens, he's going to take care of it. He's going to restore the property to its previous condition, and he's going to do it, if at all possible, reasonable condition prior to closing. He's going to do that. He agrees to do that. Now, if it's not possible, we can extend closing. Or if the seller just says, nope, not going to do it, buyer has certain rights. Buyer can terminate the contract. Buyer can say, we need to go ahead and take that extension. We need to extend this, and, give ourselves some more time here. our buyer says, you know, I'll take the insurance proceeds and credit for the deductible. Our buyer terminated contract, gets their money back and move forward. But we have an obligation of the seller to do certain things. And they need to understand if you've got the seller and something happens, and we are in the time of year where things will happen. And when things happen, the seller needs to understand he's got certain obligations. And it's from a legal standpoint, it's not important whether or not the seller has a good insurance company that's going to put a new roof on or take care of it, or whether or not the seller says, well, you know what, I know I've got insurance, but I've got a 2% deductible, and frankly, I just don't have that kind of money. Well, the agents and the parties are going to have to try to work something out to figure out how we can get that taken care of, hopefully out of the proceeds of the sale, or work with the title company, or work with the insurance company or not. But you could have a situation where the seller needs to understand what he's legally agreed to do. And if something were to happen to the property, he needs to be able to step up and take care of it. And if the seller has a situation where he just can't do it, we had a situation where it was back when we were having short sales, and there was a short sale scenario. And one of the things that we discovered in a transaction, and we had the seller, is that the seller, of course, in a short sale, had already made clear to everybody, the seller said, I don't have any money. And one of the things that the seller no longer paid for was insurance. So there was no insurance on the property. Now, having a property in West Plano, during the spring and summer is a bad time to not have insurance. And they didn't have any insurance. So we inquired of the lender who was in the short sale scenario, the lender that the seller had, and say, okay, we presume that you will want to put insurance on the property. We were surprised when the lender said, no, we're not going to do it. And what they really essentially did was they took the risk of self-insuring, hoping nothing would happen, because if it did, then they were going to have to be in a situation, while they didn't have any obligations on the property, certainly would affect them financially from the loan and what they had on it, because they already were extended past the value of the property anyway, which you have in a short sale. So the insurance issue can become a real challenge. And if you've got the seller and they're going through the process, your seller needs to understand what they've agreed to in paragraph 14, so you won't have the situation that Max had. What, by the way, did end up happening? Did they end up getting this resolved, Max? Do you remember?
What they did, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, what they did was they kind of made a side agreement between the buyer and seller. The seller did not even appeal to that agreement, and they ended up having to sue him. The seller was sued by the buyer.
Okay, and there's probably some red flags at the beginning of that relationship. Tell us that's where we're going.
Mm-hmm.
When you've got somebody that already denies their obligation on the contract, that's going to be a problem down the road. Fortunately, we weren't involved in that, right? They didn't make us part of the suit.
Oh.
Okay, good. That's a good thing. So paragraph 14, it's very important so the seller understands their obligations. And there are two timelines here, by the way. One, when something happens and there's a windstorm or something comes through the area, everybody's busy. Insurance adjusters are busy, insurance companies are busy, contractors are busy, roofers are busy. And so we need to be prepared to deal with timelines. Marcia, you had a property down in the Dallas area where you had tornado damage, and there were challenges down there, and you had to deal with all the damage done to the property there. I don't know if she's still on the listing or whatever, but I remember that was a challenge of having to be able to deal with that. And you had a buyer and a seller. You had the seller, as I recall, in that case where they had to deal with it. So you need to be familiar from the seller standpoint what the seller is agreeing to do here and what they're obligated to do. And as you have the buyer, your buyer needs to absolutely be on top of, here are my options, here are my choices. Now, the third choice that they have in here about the seller's insurance, receiving credit for it, I don't see that happening a lot. Insurance companies are not nearly as receptive to that as they did in the past. It so much depends on the insurance company itself as whether or not they'll act. So essentially, if the seller's not going to step up and take care of these things, your buyer's practical option is terminate the contract, take the owner's money back. The problem there with the buyer is they've already spent money. They've got an option fee, they've got an inspection fee, they may have an appraisal fee, they may be paying for a survey. They've spent all that money, and they want to get more than just the earnest money back. So it's going to be up to you as the agent, try to negotiate and see if the seller won't reimburse the buyer for and give them more than just the earnest money if the seller is not going to cooperate and do what he needs to do here. Questions on that? Now, what I'm about to do is open this up because you've got the contract form in front of you. And even those are the specific contracts that I wanted to address and deal with. Anything that you've got going on that you've encountered recently, that you say, wow, I sure hope we can talk about this. What are people doing about this? This would be a good time for us to be able to address that and talk about it and see if anything going out there that we can, with your experience, can help everybody else know how to do with it. So does anybody have anything you say, wow, what are we going to do about this? Or here's what I had and I don't know how to make that work. So I won't get any quick phone calls over the next couple of weeks with quick questions because you don't have any. So what I'm hearing now, we're all good. I see Becky smiling. Bob, it's okay. We're good. We're good. Okay. I have, James, you have something?
Yeah, I was gonna ask you, on that,
Okay.
back to the very first, where we were talking about those exclusions,
Yeah.
would it be a good idea to always put the refrigerator in it if it's not one of the built-in models?
That's a great question. If the seller is going to take the refrigerator, by putting it 2D, it makes it clear to the buyer that it's not going to stay.
Okay.
So that there ends up not being a question because we don't want the buyer and seller in a dispute. So, you know, if we're not clear on that, if you've got the buyer, you want to make sure you've had a really good conversation with your buyer about their expectations. As you walk through the property with your buyer, and they're looking at the chandelier or the refrigerator or the wine cooler or whatever and say, wow, well, we're going to really enjoy that. Then you need to know now, buyer says they expect to get that. So you need to make sure the contract reflects that.
Okay.
And if you've got the seller and they've already said, well, I can't believe that's a family heirloom. I can't believe anybody would think I'm going to leave that. Well, if it's something that has to say it, you know, you need to address that with the seller and they need to exclude it. From a buyer standpoint, if the seller has indicated they want to take something with them and the buyer doesn't care, then when the buyer makes the offer, they should go ahead and include it in 2D because that makes their offer a little bit more attractive. So that's a little better situation. Okay, so I see Marcia said, yeah, the day after when the contract, a huge tree crashed through. Yeah, so did y'all finally get it resolved? Yep. Okay, good. Good question, James. Okay, any other incident, any other situation? Yes, sir.
Bob, quick question for you.
Yeah.
I have buyers and we went to a property and what was on the MLS were two foundation repairs from 2016 and 2020. There was no engineer's report, either pre or post, for both of those. And so what are, obviously the buyers would need to have a structural engineer report going in.
Probably should have. Are there transferable warranties from
Yes,
foundation company?
Yes, both are transferable warranties.
Two different foundation companies?
No, same foundation company, two different areas of the house.
Okay. So here, Brian's question brings up a really important point. When you have a buyer and there's going to be a transferable warranty, roof, foundation, AC, whatever, your buyer needs to contact that company and make sure whatever was supposed to have been done so that that's a warranty that can be transferred has been done. But most importantly, the buyer needs to call that company to see if they're still in business, to make sure that they really did this work and and a foundation is, because we have, after foundation repairs, you know, we do have leak tests. We do have things that are done. And so the buyer needs to talk to the foundation company, says, okay, you've done these things. One, I need to make sure that it's a warranty that can be transferred and what's necessary there. And did they do leak tests? Are there any tests, any reports? Was the foundation work done according to an engineer's report or just according to the foundation company's report? Buyer needs to ask some good questions. You need to advise your buyer to do that. I don't want you doing it because the person who gave you the information could have given you the wrong information It could be somebody that's not there tomorrow. And you could have all kinds of challenges, and the buyers relied on your information to go ahead and close, and found out later they had bad information. So we need for them to do that and go through the process. We can get the information where they can make the call, but we need to advise them to do it, because there are several steps. Anytime there's a transferable warranty for anything of that nature, they need to ensure company. I mean, I can't tell you how many times we had companies not even in business anymore. We have this happen with roofers and foundation companies because there's not a license in Texas for either one of those. Oh, good point. Good question.
Just to recap.
Yeah.
One, verify with the company that performed the work that the work was done, what is needed for the transferable warranty
Yep.
to effect. Was the work done as per structural engineer report, and it was a leak test done, correct?
Exactly. All
Okay.
those need to be done. Absolutely.
Thanks, Bob.
Yeah, really good point. Thank you. Yep. Any other things you guys are having out there? So let me go ahead and ask you, barring that somebody jumped up, what adjustments and what changes are you seeing out there as a result of the COVID-19? And your showings and your listings, I presume you've done all the proper paperwork. You've got your buyer sign off on the advisory, got your seller sign off on the advisory, talking about the access. What are you finding as you're going through this process? What kind of adjustments are you needing to make as a result of people's awareness of the COVID-19?
Bob, this is Brian. Not everyone is practicing. And so I was at a showing on Monday, fairly hot property. There were several folks that were lined up after we were coming out. And we had masks, shoe covers, I had gloves, and I was the only one touching anything inside the house. And the agent with 5 other folks coming through behind us had nothing, no mask, no shoe covers, and so my clients had pointed that out, and I said, that's precisely why we're taking these measures, because we can't control what someone else does.
And that is a very good point. One of the good points of that is that really lets us point out our value proposition, that we're doing everything we can to keep everybody safe in this whole procedure, both in listing and showing and working through the process. The bigger risk, in my opinion, is the health risk. And you're right, we can't make other people do things or not do things. But what we've got to do is do what we can and make sure our client, whoever the seller or buyer, understands and appreciates what we're doing to protect them and to protect ourselves, and protect our family, because that's a very valid thing we all need to be doing. And we can't control other people, but stay away from them, because we no telling what they're bringing with them as you go through the process. Okay, so I see Becky said, I got the buyer, had a foundation company, would not give me info I wanted on warranty. In that case, the buyers, you got to transmit that to the buyer, and the buyer's got to make a decision, because what essentially they're saying is you may not have a warranty at all. And on a situation where forms you need on a lease, in addition to the certification property access for sellers, you also have a certification property access for tenants. And when the seller, most sellers say, yeah, I think the tenant should be protected too. So let's have this form that's used for tenants. So it's the same form essentially, except it talks about tenants rather than sellers. So that'd be a good form to make use of. And then Wanda, I've used the COVID entry form, seller and his tenant. Buyers entering contract had no problem signing. House across the street, we're on the market, no mention code forms or procedures. We're finding, and there are always exceptions to anything, but we're finding a lot of the smaller companies, nothing against smaller companies, but they don't have the same awareness and training level that sometimes larger companies have, maybe because we just feel more exposure. We're making sure that we're on top of all the forms and everything. So yeah, I'm not surprised you've got some out there who are not doing it. Doesn't mean that you shouldn't step up and make sure that your people are following the right procedures as you interact with those fine folks. And she says, and by the way, there's another KW office. Well, you might in another venue let me know who that is, and I'll visit with their risk manager person. We'll talk about that. And then Marcia, buyers who wanted to have their families come and see the property all at the same time, a limited number of people. Yeah, you got to do that. And, you know, certainly if you're in Dallas County, there's no question the rule is you got to have a mask. You got to have protective gear. You've got to work through that on anything in Dallas County. But it's just a good practice wherever you are. So if you've got additional people, you do need to limit the number of people in there and make sure everybody has a mask and work through that. So I think it's way good. Anything else you guys might have? Great conversation. Good questions. Hopefully, so give me a quick assessment. And I do want you to say something. How are we doing with this Zoom stuff? Is this working out for you, giving you enough control over your time and where you're doing things from that it turns out to be a benefit that we're able to bring you this information? I see Marcia put a good thumbs up. Thank you very much for that. So we're getting some good responses. Zoom is good. Love Zoom. Calls with you. Okay, good. Yes. Good. I see you. Okay. Well, thank you for that. It certainly gives me some good control, although, as I've said before, and I told Marcia this, you know, we all adjust to this working from home differently. It's been really hard for me. And my daughter, Julie, my daughter/assistant, certainly understands this because she's been very helpful to get things for her and bring her. But I this working at home all the time, and I don't have an explanation. I'm busier than I've ever been. I don't know why, but I am. It's hard for me to work through and get things done and all that. But it's really hard. I need my peeps. It's just hard. I'm about to have to go into therapy to deal with all this kind of, although I don't know if we can do therapy now or not, whatever. I've opened it up, so maybe you can. But, you know, it's a lot of things about it that I've been able to be more effective, more timely on. And I see some real pluses, and I see we'll make use of this even after the fact. And you know, I think that we're going to continue. I'll do another video. Julie would help me do a video where I can provide information and do some more Zooms. But I appreciate everybody's cooperation, working through it. Any other quick additional questions anybody might have? Because we're about ready to move on. I'm about ready to call this thing a day. If you don't have something. Anything? Well, thank you everybody much for being here. Appreciate it, big time. And I'm going to adjourn this here meeting. Thank you very much. Everybody can leave now. Bye, everybody.